Samuel Beckett's Ping exposes the absurdity of anticipation. Published in 1967, the densely worded prose short portrays a declining figure that absorbs basic sensory data in a harsh, white environment. The suffocating syntactic and lexical form provokes fundamental questions about the value of literature and the forlorn desire of the reader to follow conventional narrative progression. Famously, much of the contemporary discussion of its relative merits appeared in Encounter, the journal where it first appeared, in English. Critic Ihab Hassan had predicted its existence through the lens of anti-literature. David Lodge responded to it as a referential work of art. My view is that a political reading of the text negotiates these contrasting critical perspectives. The figure exists under some external order, under some locus of authority, and the reader's attempt to understand its plight is akin to the reader's ability to understand their own plight under modern forms of sovereignty. Crucially, in Ping, Beckett elides humanity as an operative political category and the human as a philosophical account of human nature. Carl Schmitt's rejection of humanity as a political category is widely documented and discussed, but his consideration of the human is less noted. His early satire, The Buribunks, published in 1918, has not been much read or analysed as a commentary on human nature. Comparing the Buribunks and Ping allows me to find new angles on the relationship between the human and humanity as ideas that bear upon sovereignty in Schmitt and in Beckett. The process of anticipation debilitates the fictional group known as the Buribunks, who are quasi-human diary keepers, which offers a striking counterpart to the process of anticipation that debilitates the Ping figure. Despite this critique of anticipation, Schmitt pursues abstractions, symbols, and figures of political anticipation throughout his work, citing at various points Herman Melville's Benito Cereno, the Catacon, and Epimetheus as anticipatory images of the political. Beckett, on the other hand, indicates the comic pointlessness of such a search, showing the anticipatory Ping figure as an incomprehensible and overwhelming set of sense impressions, whose negative meaning can be, via my comparative reading, identified as a rejection of Schmitt's self-regarding search for anticipatory symbolism. Schmitt forecast an era of gross Raum, translated as great spaces, in his treatise The Nomos of the Earth, published in 1950, which redefined his concept of sovereignty as determined by large competing territorial groupings. 15 years later, Beckett began his series of compressed prose shorts gathered in the informal trilogy of Imagination, Dead Imagine, Ping, and Lessness, which rearticulated his preoccupation with waiting, reducing his fictions to an elemental and insistent arrangement of words. Beckett depicts anticipation as necessarily spatial and focuses on desiccated figures of inaction in these depictions. They appear not quite human and so partake in his concern with the human. For Schmitt, the theorizing of spatial orders challenges humanity as the dominant organizing principle of world politics. From a philosophical perspective, both writers were cautious to offer clear characterizations of human nature. From the perspective of politics, both were wary of a normative world system predicated on the universalistic language of humanity. For Schmitt, the anticipatory condition is open to ridicule. His first creative attempt to represent and satirize the state of anticipation, a sort of inversion of his state of exception, appeared before he had published any of his major works. The Buribunks is the product of his experiences as a young man working in the legal academy and under military command. At 17 pages, it is dense, repetitive fiction that speculates on a world obsessively recorded by the Buribunks. These compulsive labourers, physically malformed and bizarre figurations, must perpetually document the present, recording all events in history as they occur to them. The Buribunks are thus subjects that become non-human by virtue of their incessant activity. Beckett's Ping is likewise dense and repetitive, albeit at only 1,030 words. In this story, a barely visible subject to the reader struggles through what appears to be its final moments of consciousness. He, she, it, the reader does not know, exists in a small box where the surrounding white walls trigger glimpsed memories. The subject uses rudimentary sense perception to process and articulate the immediate situation, during which it is disturbed by the infrequent sound of ping. Unlike the Buribunks, this subject becomes non-human by virtue of its paralytic stasis, its surrendering to inactivity and pure thought. In Buribunks and Ping, then, Schmitt and Beckett approach, in distinctive ways, the problem of anticipation and its effect on ideas of the human and of humanity. Beckett's understanding of anticipation is like Schmitt's, but it also entails a very different stance and affective relationship to who counts as human. Bringing the two texts side by side helps illuminate more starkly and precisely two observations. One, the relationship between anticipation and both writers' ideas of the human, and two, the value of the human as less and then as more than a political category. Whereas the Buribunks mark Schmitt's decisive shift from a cultural to a political thinker, Ping is central, both chronologically and aesthetically, to Beckett's late prose shorts, which are more concerned with the formal processes of anticipation than in depicting a fully rendered and realised anticipatory state of being. According to Beckett, Ping was, quote, the result or miniaturization of the lost ones, abandoned because of its intractable complexities, and a separate work written after and in reaction to this text. The textual process of Ping appears to have been physically arduous for Beckett, who had pared down his writing to its most essential form. Originally written in French, entitled Ping, Ping underwent 10 revisions before Beckett translated it into English. C.J. Ackley and S.E. Gontarski note that the multiple manuscripts show the, quote, division of the text into a tablature. Meters are changed to yards, indicative of a shift of sensibility. Olympian hauteur abandoned for the obsessive repetition of limited sounds. In the French versions, ping consists of two sounds, bing and op. Beckett merged these ideas into a single onomatopoeia for the English translation. Some changes were thus phonetic, others pertain to the story's limited content. As Brian Finney states, quote, the first text shows similar atmospheric variations, and by the 10th and final draft, light and heat have become static, ladder and niches have disappeared, and the body is left in a coffin-like box in silence and stasis. There are few discernible objects remaining in Beckett's final arrangement, which favours unconventional syntax, mostly omitting prepositions and conjunctions. The first-time reader finds it immediate comprehension difficult and cogent interpretation hard to sustain. Beckett's prose shorts are residual, the cast-offs and reformulations of longer pieces. They are discrete in isolation, but offer refractions of the human condition when viewed together. Using the shorter form, Beckett maintains anticipation through distorted movements that are difficult to discern. These literary moves may be extended, quick, sparse, frantic, but they suggest linearity. Paralysis does not necessitate stasis. To be fixed in time is not a moral preference or a source of inherent value or a desirable method of representation. These pieces retain movement, but also try to replicate artworks, sketches, and compositions. As in abstract painting, Beckett evokes stillness and chronology, something over which the eye might roam, but without anything teleological about its progress. He proposes that the reader looks around and across the text, just as the viewer looks around and across a painting. As in music, Beckett offers permutations, repetitions, modulations, and deviations. He keeps the reader's ear to a metronome before producing onomatopoeic interruptions, a twang, or in this instance, a ping. Ping is part of a creative lineage, more fragmentary than Imagine Dead Imagine, its predecessor, but not so apparently randomized and mathematical as Lessness, its successor. These works are fundamentally concerned with the nature of literary representation, how it deceives, and how it can be pared back to its essence, revealing new meanings while ironizing conventional telling. Suzanne Brienza and Peggy Knapp note that together the fictions, quote, offer glimpses of traditional myths in ironic, parodied, or aborted form. For them, Ping is a strange prose poem that contains a doll-like entity, which is at once odd and familiar, its existence presented to the reader as if, quote, sterilized through the mind of a third person detached narrator who acts as a jerky camera eye, shifting to view and record his subjects from different angles. This is not an identifiable world inhabited by moving bodies and human characters, but, quote, a grotesque inhuman enclosure in which the creatures are trapped both physically and psychologically. These descriptions suggest that in Ping, the nature of the subject and the space in which it is contained remain fundamentally uncertain. Human, but not. The minimalist sequence of events is absorbed into a form, genre, and perspective that cannot be precisely designated, in a style which leads the reader to confuse prose as poetry, fiction as trickery, and narrator as subject. Ping first appeared in the British literary magazine Encounter, and its subsequent reception has been heavily influenced by the contemporary criticism surrounding its initial publication in the journal. In the literature of silence, Ihab Hassan's overview of anti-literary tendencies among leading fiction writers preceded Beckett's story by a month, but foresaw its experimental method and approach. Hassan's immediately satisfied prediction was likely the result of some editorial decision-making, and David Lodge's more straightforward review, Some Ping Understood, concluded February's edition in the following year. Scholarship on Ping is often positioned in relation to these two pieces. Lodge's retrospective view is that the story meets the conditions of a traditionally referential, meaningful work of literary art. Hassan's prophesying account suggests that the story functions not as a story at all, but as an exquisite exemplar of anti-literature, the grand sum of avant-garde tendencies prevalent in the period. Beyond the critical debates framed by Hassan and Lodge, I wonder how thinking about both the compressed form of Ping and its appeal to reduced images brings into relief ideas of sovereign representation. The story is distinctively placed to consider spatial and temporal effects on the images of sovereignty because of its rendering of anticipation through moments of 1 second, contained within a space of 1 yard, about the extent to which an average adult human can reach. While readings have been influenced by this bracketing derived from Hassan and Lodge, this paper's reading of Ping is indebted to J.M. Kurtzia, whose essay 8 Ways of Looking at Samuel Beckett identifies the most significant attribute of the late prose Beckettian subject. Quote, it's trying to be understood, language creaks under the strain, how the universe works, what the laws are. This state of anticipation is constituted by the sovereign authority who makes the laws and the subject who tries forlornly to abide by them. The sovereign thinks it gleans knowledge about the subject through the subject's ability to follow the rules, but the sovereign cannot exactly fathom the relationship between the subject's body and mind, and nor, probably, can the subject. Kurtzia illustrates his reading of Beckett through the variegated idea of the subject as, quote, creature, it, I, the laboratory animal, that is seeking to comprehend a persistently toggled system of nut procurement. In this analogy, Beckett's subject wants to locate and eat the nut, but the organization of tubes keeps shifting, so it does not know where the nut will land. In its game, the sovereign thinks itself omniscient, but it cannot perceive the true workings of the subject it has created, just as the subject is perpetually doomed to be tricked by the evolving maze of shoots. The subject may be composed of body and mind, but it does not know for certain, and according to Beckett, there may not be much use in knowing it anyway. For Beckett, the state of anticipation is as grim for the subject as it is comic for the sovereign, but even if both their existences are meaningful, the certitude that knowledge precedes action eludes the pair of them. Kurtzia's meditation on the non-human it reveals Beckett's suspicion of sure, stable philosophical accounts of the human in intellectual life. In sum, Kurtzia's reading the non-human condition, as illustrated through Ping, moralizes about human nature, while Schmitt's criticism of the inhuman category, beginning in the Buribunks, which I will now discuss, performs a moralizing refusal of morality as a political category. So the Buribunks has recently undergone renewed scholarly appraisal and a full translation in English, originally published in 1918 in the journal Summa and edited by the essayist France Belay. The Buribunks is about diary keepers whose sole purpose is to obsessively document the present to preclude the uncertain future. These function as avatars for Schmitt's manifold contemporary critical targets: bohemians, positivists, rationalists, and machine utopians. Buribunks transcribe notes and submit entries to the extent they become physically transformed, absorbing the tools of their labor. Pen and ink become body and blood. Every Buribunk is alienated from the other. Each suffers from an isolated and corrupted identity. Schmitt's despair towards the contemporary sovereign subject finds its form in this speculative fiction on anticipation, which confronts the modernist tendency to define consciousness as that which must perceive and account for everything all of the time. Neglecting external portraiture, Buribunks are rather fixated with documenting the self. Schmitt focuses on those who value autobiography over reality, because he was anxious that for such a person, autobiography is in fact reality. Schmitt delineates this section of his critique by creating an imagined genealogy of biographers in a text, beginning with Don Juan, who lives only in the moment, his servant Leporello, and the fictionalized Furka and Schnecker, all failed portraitists who each develops the medium and paves the way for the ultimate autobiographers, the Buribunks. Scholars variously describe this text as surrealistic, a dystopia, a mockery of the secular ritual of confession, a satire of detached intellectualism, an ironic world history of inscription, a critique of modern subjectivity, and a biting caricature of the boheme and of positivism. Such characterizations suggest and subvert its classification as a modernist text, hinting at modes and genres of modernism while remaining contemptuous of the putative aesthetic subjectivities modernism desired to represent. Through techniques of extended irony and self-reflexive footnotes, Schmitt challenges the Wilhelmine culture that had failed to respond to a call for political clarity and visibility. He sought to critique an age that venerated rules and norms, celebrated scientific arrogance, idolized the podium of selfhood, and valorized technological advance. Published on the cusp of two eras, as the desultory Kaiserreich made way for the democratic promise of the Weimar Republic, the Buribunks satirizes and ironizes the putatively liberal tendency of the historical moment, futile anticipation of the political event. This tendency is what the sovereign decision on the exception, theorized 4 years later in political theology, negates and overwhelms. In the Buribunks, Schmitt ridicules the process of accumulating details, which he assigns to the world of legal positivism, the juridical landscape with which he was closely acquainted. In political theology, he theorizes sovereignty as the borderline, which satisfies his cravings for political clarity and visibility. It provides the effective counterpoint to the liberal politics of dense accumulation and hazy pluralism. For Schmitt, the world of the Buribunks is one in which institutions are conspicuous and unwieldy, the practice of historicism is self-important and futile, and the individual is devitalized and detached from value systems. Although fictionalized diaries are common to literary dystopias, Reinhard Koselleck argues that these conditions of institutionalism, historicism, and the cult of the individual form a, quote, negative utopia in which the Buribunks represent, quote, the interior turned outward. The public accumulation of interiority constitutes a project of surveillance, which Koselleck calls, quote, a mode of the performance of perfected terror. More accurately, the Buribunks is, I think, a twofold dissection, which argues that obsessive accumulation of details devalues the nature of interiority, and that constant documentation of events obscures the experience of reality. Schmitt renders the mind as a hard surface, or as another unit of measurement, to critique the belief that selfhood can be understood, interrogated, and articulated, insofar as history can be mastered, coerced, and anticipated. In the Buribunks, the obsessive process of anticipation debilitates the body. The Buribunks undergo physiological changes because of their diary keeping. Their growing intellect correlates with an enlarged mouth. Consciousness and selfhood produce corporeal effects on anatomical surfaces. Schmitt creates an alternative rendering of the human body, comprising deformed faces, creaturely habits, and machine-like tendencies. He further invokes the body to outline the sense of uncertainty that provokes extreme anticipation. The dread with which the Buribunks view the future is described as, quote, the dark body, imposing, fearful, racialized, which is precluded by an obsessive anticipatory present. The Buribunks ignore the sovereign decision, as Schmitt understands it, in favor of the accumulative detail that generates outward order. The Buribunks are biophysically transformed through their vast data production and bureaucratic surveillance. Their deification of communal processes thwarts the pursuit of human meaningfulness. For Schmitt, the desire not to produce excessive temporal proximity leads only to psychological indulgence, not physical vitality. So, repetitive actions and peculiar countenances define the Buribunks. Schmitt suggests tackling, quote, the problem at its central, most interesting point, comparing the study of the Buribunks to popular contemporary anthropological assessments. According to Schmitt's dubiously constructed narrator, it is, quote, the intellect that designs the body. and by stating this, he blurs the mind-body distinction. This emphasis on the relationship between interiority and corporeal imagery is one of the most insistent aspects of the text. Quote, "It would therefore be careless, to say the least, to simply deem the diary to be the decisive fact in an intellectual sense rather than the enlarged mouth," Schmitt writes, before illustrating the correlation between intellect and physiognomy by using the example of tribes and employing a form of ironic racism. Given the anthropology of the period in which large lips were taken as a serious indicator of primitiveness, it's not entirely clear whether Schmitt, a notable future Nazi, is satirizing forms of social Darwinism. The pompous narrator lists lesser people, quote, "and other tribes incapable of education who have a relatively small mouth, even though they are cannibals." These views initiate a probable, quote, "close connection between the enlarged mouth and a higher intellect." The defining message of the Buribunks is that to quantify and repeat is to perpetually anticipate. Within this fictive state, the commitment to research means that the study of the Buribunks is valued more than the Buribunks themselves. Schmitt calls this mode of inquiry, quote, "scientific Buribunkology," which amounts to a chronically aware, self-justifying metasphere of learning. It is smug, circular, overly referential, and ever inwardly expanding. This continued expansion leads to indelibility. To create, to manufacture, and to multiply constitutes success and supremacy. This economy functions at maximum output and at optimum delineation. This functioning holds innate value because quantity is made into quality by virtue of its facticity. This predates Schmitt's critique of liberalism, which he thinks, quote, "discusses and negotiates every political detail in the hope that the definitive dispute, the decisive bloody battle, can be transformed into a parliamentary debate and permit the decision to be suspended forever in everlasting discussion." Schmitt polemically dramatized parliamentary democracy as a mode of government made up exclusively of discussion. His ironic appraisal of scientific Buribunkology presages his appraisal of political liberalism. In the Buribunks, constant documentation is a source of fact beyond mere science. This sense of superiority and of the supreme idea of fact makes scientific Buribunkology the overwhelming and most conclusive sphere of knowledge and understanding, even, quote, "more than theology, jurisprudence, or philosophy." Any refusal to keep a diary must be, quote, "justified and described in detail." The disobedient Buribunks will otherwise face elimination to the lowest class in the system. For them, elimination is a fate worse than death. With echoes of Beckett, Schmitt states that, quote, "the wheel of progress passes silently over the silent one." Such a punitive measure enforces a simple idea, that in this world, even nothing must be reproduced in detail. Schmitt sardonically expresses the oversaturated and falsely unifying nature of the Buribunks' project. Quote, "What would all research be without the secret weaving of the spirit, which transforms lifeless details into a living organism, and for the purpose of repeated comprehension, elevates every act of perception to a process of remembrance?" The study of scientific Buribunkology forms the logical endgame for an academy obsessed with both organization and transformation, which is inscribed through both quantitative and qualitative output. Schmitt remains skeptical of details that are rationalized, contextualized, and historicized. He ironically scolds the inchoate and prototypical Leporello, who has, quote, "less of an urge to gather reliable research into details. Nowhere does he trace the deeper connections of the specific conquest." As a sign of intellectual progress in scientific Buribunkology, quote, "entries of an erotic, demonic, satirical, political, and so on nature are grouped together under the strictest observation of the copyright law pertaining to each entry." So life is sterile relative to the mode of scientific inquiry that seeks to understand it. Memory, otherwise clipped and intangible, is solidified and certified on repeat. This predates Schmitt's metaphor of the crusted mechanism, consisting of rules and norms that have grown torpid by repetition, which his exception seeks to overcome. Schmitt wishes to, quote, "trace the outlines of the sociological architecture and provide, quote, a philosophy of the Buribunks." The central claim in the Buribunks' manifesto is, quote, "thinking is nothing other than soundless speech, speaking nothing but scriptless writing, writing nothing but anticipated publishing, and therefore publishing is identical with writing, with such minor differences that they may be safely disregarded." The Buribunks write and publish simultaneously, and by doing so, they distort notions of time and of the body. Through their extreme efforts to anticipate, they merge their commodity with their labor. As Schmitt later noted in Postwar Detention, Quote, our life acquires furrows and lines through our labours, through our productivity in work and profession. In the biophysical imperative to transform themselves, the Buribunks face a process which makes it impossible to discern between I, the typewriter, and history. Historical reality denotes the past, the midwife the present, and the dark body the future. The use of language precipitates Schmitt's full embrace of legal and political solutions to the problem of sovereignty. His satirically loose use of metaphor in the Buribunks illustrates his resistance to claims that a mere image could anticipate the exception. In political theology, he resorts to the crusted mechanism and the torpor of repetition for dulled anticipatory symbolism. His use of metaphor concedes to aesthetic sensibilities in his theory of sovereignty. His cravings for the borderline concept produce a distorted silhouette, a phantasm of the immediate sovereign decision. It is a reminder of how he chides, quote, the rationalists, who should know that the legal system itself can anticipate the exception and can suspend itself. Ellen Kennedy notes that Schmitt's early literary efforts assume, quote, a world in which there are no definitions, where everything is possible. These works, quote, explore nominalism, the irrational, the apparent, but not real. In his short story, The Mirror, published in 1912, 6 years before the Buribunks, Schmitt narrates the life of a young man who falls into a Narcissus-like state, his life defined by the projection of his selfhood, entering literally into his reflection. Kennedy describes this section as, quote, a Kafkaesque evocation of things transformed or realized. Schmitt personifies the mirrors within the story as knowing the, quote, nullity of the world and of all things, even the nullity of their own selves. They abandoned the spurious self-evidence of the I am. The mercury coating felt away, the transparent glass remained, and the souls rose to the world soul, where all individuality vanishes. This satirizing of the world soul, which becomes the world spirit in the Buribunks, underpins Schmitt's critique of humanity as a political category. So, how can we draw the conversation back to Beckett? Beckett did not look for grand narratives of history. He rather sifted through the details of disorder, accumulating names and dates, finding depositories of items that could constitute a record of human existence. He was drawn in, quote, not by the wave, but the corks upon it. Beckett's investment in bobbing debris characterizes his claims to existence, providing a matter-of-fact illustration of what he thought to be the sum of human knowledge and resilience. Beckett settled in Paris in 1937, and in the post-war period, the cultural and social conditions of France encouraged disquiet. In an essay on the Dutch painters brothers Geer and Bram van Velde, published in 1946, Beckett references the instrumentalizing of the human category in the political domain, writing that the human is a, quote, a word, and doubtless a concept too, that is reserved for times of great massacres. Beckett references the, quote, dum-dum bullet to describe the secret malice of the human as a political category, particularly in times when violence is enacted in its name. This is apt comparison for the pernicious semantics of humanity, because though the dum-dum projectile appears to be like any normal bullet, it discreetly expands on impact, forging a devastating wound in the recipient. The surreptitious exploding shell apes the use of weasel words about a common universal standard of humanity. For him, the post-war individual invokes the human and humanity to obfuscate the facts. Beckett shares Schmitt's anxieties about the framing of history as one of ceaseless human development, but is more ironic in identifying, as Lindsay Stonebridge puts it, quote, the contingency of moral language and, quote, the consensual humanism of the post-war linguistic terrain. So Beckett and Schmitt express fundamental concerns about the language of humanity and its rhetorical deployment in the political domain. For both, the multiple misuse of words under liberal auspices is symptomatic of a deceitful political culture. From different perspectives, both fret over the nullification of honest language in the public realm. Schmitt maintained concerns that liberal forms of talkative, normative, and consensus-driven politics create spurious notions of the human and humanity, which come to be deemed as legitimate, ethical, and political categories. In the essay, The Age of Neutralizations and Depoliticizations, published in 1929, Schmitt warns about the increasing use of technical classifications of humanity in the political domain, desiring to, quote, recognize the secret law of this vocabulary, and know that the most terrible war is pursued only in the name of peace, the most terrible oppression only in the name of freedom, and the most terrible inhumanity only in the name of humanity. Schmitt sees evil ends in the apparently neutral language of technology and international ethics. Universalism as a political strategy made Schmitt anxious because invocations of humanity obscure and seek to denature the friend-enemy distinction. Schmitt thinks that political life is only vivid and real if this distinction is maintained and made real. In the Concept of Political, published in 1932, Schmitt identifies the consequences of the linguistic infestation of humanity in politics. The adversary, quote, is thus no longer called an enemy, but a disturber of peace, and is thereby designated to be an outlaw of humanity. In his view, common moral principles risk turning international relations and domestic politics into conflicts between the human and the inhuman, rather than between legitimate competing actors who, on traditional terms, would merely win or lose. Eliminating these crucial differences erases clear and distinct political identities, making a defeated actor not only a loser, but an illegitimate adversary. For Schmitt, characterizing a political opponent as inhuman makes the conflict itself inhuman. Schmitt argues that the state harnesses the concept of humanity as a political category to increase its power and capacity for expansion. In the Nomos of the Earth, published in 1950, Schmitt maintains this deeply held apprehension, cautioning his readers about the consequences of a certain type of politics underpinned by and entwined with law, warning of the fate of legality and the purely legalistic state. The surrendering of political representation and discursive clarity to the terminology and mechanisms of liberal tenocracies produces deleterious effects on intellectual life, because what defines the language of liberalism is its plenitude and tendency to foster insidious subterranean meanings. Schmitt sees this manifestation of liberal legality everywhere, not just in politics, and draws connections between the rhetoric of universalism and prevailing techniques of contemporary art practices. Quote, what began as the message of the gods of reason has ended in the gangster slogan of Bertolt Brecht. For Schmitt, neither law nor humanity nor reason, the constituent elements of liberalism, function as a name because each does not possess the symbolic power required of effective political representation. Schmitt argues that Brecht's didactic dramaturgy forms the natural analogue and endpoint of Enlightenment rationality, which undermines the ability to isolate and define decisive terms of existence. Schmitt later derides, quote, the political experiences and popular pedagogical enlightenments given expression by Brecht, which have contributed to the fact that legality is nothing more than a synonym for mob rule. In this instance, the aesthetic domain has poisoned the language of politics, and vice versa. For Schmitt, the fixation on legal processes as a substitute for political action obscures the visibility of the sovereign and illegitimately delegates authority to an excited cohort of voices. Beckett's internalized and elusive absurdist works are the antithesis of Brecht's externalized and instructional epic theatre, even though both sought to capture and undercut dramatic assertions of the self. Beckett's essay on the Van Velds concerns itself with the internal nature of the art object, but is focused on problems associated with externalized modes of critique. His argument is as follows. Neither referential nor impressionistic criticism does full justice to the relevant art object under scrutiny. Any context provided is likely too much context to adequately illuminate the art object. Critics remain overly reliant on the literary vocabulary transposed onto the artistic realm, which overall obscures the true nature of painting. In the hope of naming and explaining, the words of criticism often deceive, regardless of whether they appear to be in good or bad faith. For Beckett, the inability to comprehend the nature of painting extends to the inability to aesthetically represent the self. That the individual is comprised of a mind and body is absurd, so it follows that humanity, as a collective noun for these individuals, for all these minds and bodies, is a derisory conceit. Beckett's view of contemporary art criticism has this in common with Schmitt's view of Brecht's writing. Both forms overload their subjects with too much direction, too many words, and a set of misjudged meanings. So, to conclude, reading Beckett with Schmitt's work emphasizes the value of thinking about how their similar critiques lead to different aesthetics and political beliefs. Beckett's attempts to reconcile ideas of sovereignty and anticipation illuminate Schmitt's permanent anxieties about the liberal, technocratic desire to record, document, and accumulate details. These processes undermine the visibility of the sovereign decision and the clarity of political life. Beckett depicts the futility of too much meaning, interpretation, illustration, and construction, gesturing towards the unknowable qualities of the future. Whereas Schmitt offers the image of the mirror as a literary metaphor for mimesis and to mock rationalist egoism, and the crusted mechanism to show the torpor of liberalism, and Benito Cereno, the Catacon and Epimetheus as avatars of order, Beckett rather invokes the desolate subject and bare setting to articulate the folly of the anticipatory condition. As demonstrated by Ping, Beckett reproduces the void of human experience through techniques of spatial reduction and temporal compression. I finally suggest that Schmitt's excessive maximalist literary style in the Buribunks provides a formal inversion of Beckett's reduced fiction in Ping, even as both works formulate forceful concerns about the excess of information and the anticipation of images in politics and in literature. And that's your lot.